Time for a change. That's the mantra following the 2021 German election. The Merkel era is ending. The parties hoping to form the next government promise to make this country fit for the future. But do those whose future hangs in the balance believe them? What does the election result mean for the generation under 30? How do young people see the coalition maneuvering that's now getting underway? Their lives have been deeply impacted by the pandemic's effects on schools and the economy. Their futures will be profoundly shaped by the next government's answer to the climate crisis. Do they feel they have a voice? Our topic, Youth Vote. How much change does Germany need? And it's a great pleasure to welcome our guests. Ragida Banam is a freelance journalist with family ties to Lebanon. And she says Germany has an opportunity under an SPD-led government to be more inclusive of people with migration background. It's also a pleasure to welcome Valerie Höhne. She's an editor of the German news magazine Der Spiegel. And her opening statement is, young people in Germany have shaped the debate about climate change. Any coalition will have to answer to them. And I'm very pleased to welcome our colleague from DW. He's a political correspondent in our Berlin bureau, Benjamin Alvarez, and he thinks Germany's aging population is impeding real political change. Even though young voters are a minority, their concerns should be taken more seriously. So let me ask all of you, now that German voters have had their say, what your take is on the result. Thumbs up or thumbs down? And if I look at your opening statement, Ragida, it sounds like you're pretty optimistic, while Benjamin is skeptical, and Valerie, I'm not quite sure. So let me just go straight around the table. Please, Ragida, thumbs up or thumbs down? Thumbs up or thumbs down?
Well, I think it is optimistic, to be honest, because it's the first time we see that there isn't any more two big parties that are taking everything and then forming a government with a small junior partner. Now, we're going to see for the first time ever in Germany that there will be three partners in the coalition. And the main partner has only taken approximately 25% of the votes. So they will be leading, but they will be leading, taking into consideration the other two parties, which I'm assuming will be the Greens and the Liberals. And the Greens, most essentially, will be an important partner because I think the way also the results came and the two big parties did not win enough votes over the threshold of 30% is because of the Green and all what the Greens represented from the climate change, fighting the climate change and all that. The two big parties could not maybe bring all this on the agenda as much as they should have. So a lot of those votes went to the Greens instead. And then the two big parties had to implement this in their agenda and their manifestos, and they ended up winning, but not, fully.
Benjamin, how do you see it?
You're right, Melinda. I'm skeptical, but I would lean to thumbs up because it's the end of an era, and end of an era always means there's possibility for change. And now with coalition talks and new parties gaining a lot of ground, I think it's a possibility also for younger voters and their ideas also to make it into the political debate.
Let me ask you, did anything particularly surprise you about the election results?
I would say in general that a lot of young people not only voted for the Greens, but also for the pro-business FDP. That was quite surprising for me. I'm sure we'll talk about that later.
We're definitely going to unpack that result a little bit later. Valerie, where do you stand? Thumbs up, thumbs down, or somewhere in the middle?
Well, I think for me, the best thing about this election result was that it showed that the election was won in the middle. So the FDP, the Green Party, the CDU or the Union and the SPD, they all had, gains and shifts, but the AfD essentially lost a little bit. And so I thought that was great. And
not only the AfD, but also the left-wing party.
Right, the left-wing party also lost. So it really came back to the middle a little bit more, but then it spread out within the middle, which I think is really interesting. And I agree, it can be sort of an opportunity, a catalyst for maybe change that has to happen. But also, it's still in the middle. So it's not a radical. It's not going to be a totally radical revolution that we're going to see now. I don't think the Green Party wants that. I don't think the SPD wants that. None of the parties want that. So I think it's a good sign for our democracy that people felt they could vote for parties of the middle and still and that those parties represented what they wanted to change in the country.
Can I just ask you, when you talk to young German friends and colleagues, do they feel that their voices were heard by the parties that were contending in this election?
I think that mostly they did. Some of my friends, especially my younger friends, they are quite politicized, and they're active for the Green Party or the SPD or CDU. But so I have it's a wide variety sort of standpoints, but they all feel that they were heard, and I think more so than in past elections. So I think especially the Green Party taking on this more significant role within the party system has led to that, but also the SPD sort of coming from this, they were absolutely shattered a few years ago, right? And so they've sort of reestablished themselves, and the Jusos, the young Social Democrats, also played a big role in that. And I think that was very important for a lot of people.
We'll come back to that as well in a moment. But let's take a closer listen to young people's voices. Nearly 3 million people voted for the first time in last weekend's vote. Many of them were in kindergarten when Angela Merkel took over the helm of Germany 16 years ago. We went to Leipzig to meet 2 young first-time voters.
I think the federal election was ordinary. I just hope that we get a stable government and don't have a new chancellor every few months like in Italy, but that we have something that's actually stable. It's just not quite clear which government coalition it'll be now, and whether it's really as progressive as people wished for in the run-up to the election. But I'm not that worried about it. With a stronger presence from the Green Party and a strong FDP, and a relatively weakened CDU and SPD, the issues that concern the smaller coalition partners can also be at the top of the agenda. Having a strategy in place for climate protection instead of just objectives. What will pensions look like in 30, 40 years? How will all of that work? That was the big question for me. That was super important for my voting decision. Merkel's departure after 16 years means managing the next 4 years without her for the first time, and I think that will be difficult.
So perhaps a little bit of a sense of missing Angela Merkel there at the end. In fact, Regida, Angela Merkel is the only chancellor who many first-time voters can remember. Will they miss her? Will you miss her?
Well, I'm not that young, but it's interesting because I also heard that someone that young was asking, can a man actually be a chancellor of Germany? Because Angela Merkel has really taken the memory of all those young voters for the first time. And she was such a powerful leader, and she reigned over 16 years of stability in Germany, that for a lot of people now it's really worrying. What's going to happen now that Angela Merkel is not in power anymore? Will we not see the stability keep going on? And it was interesting that also the 2 main candidates, Armin Laschet and Olaf Scholz, they both tried to represent themselves as they're going to be the continuity for Angela Merkel, and they're going to keep the country stable even without her. I mean, we all remember how Scholz, being from the SPD and or even the CDU, also wrote, you can be a chancellor, Kanzlerin, as a female. So it's interesting that this sense of stability has stayed throughout Merkel's years, and now, people are wondering, are we going to stay a stable country without Merkel?
Let me ask you about another aspect of that, because your opening statement did mention diversity and inclusion. Of course, it was Angela Merkel who made the decision to open the doors and let in 1 million refugees. Are you confident that you seem optimistic about diversity going forward, but are you confident that there will be that kind of a commitment from other politicians?
I'm not confident, I'm hopeful, because, well, I'm hopeful also if it was an SPD-led coalition, not a CDU-led coalition, because Merkel was something of she was not the CDU. And now, after Merkel left, the CDU is going to be a totally different party. And actually, a lot of refugees who came, Syrian refugees who came in 2015, voted for, the ones who were allowed to vote, voted for Merkel their families who were here before them. But now they're not as hopeful after Merkel left, and now they're switching to other parties, to the SPD mainly, or the Greens, because they have a much more welcoming refugee culture. She did not go as far as introducing laws to properly integrate the refugees in terms of maybe dual nationality, or in terms of even degrees that they could, work with immediately without having to spend years trying to convert them and be able to work in Germany. So that's why I said I was hopeful.
Benjamin, Merkel herself was a gifted juggler, if you will, in the political circus, keeping numerous balls in the air and certainly earning great respect amongst many people, both abroad and here at home. Is there another politician currently active in Germany who has those kind of political skills and foreign policy acumen?
I don't think so. And especially what you just said, I think that's very interesting. Angela Merkel is not the CDU, and a lot of people who don't like what the CDU is doing or don't like these conservative ideas, don't criticize her for that. I mean, they see her as for the human part. When we look at this picture and you have a leader who's leaving after 16 years, who's taking pictures, with parrots, leaving, and you can imagine her, going back to a really, really normal life after 16 years. It's incredible if you compare it to other world leaders. Or in other regions, in Latin America, if we had someone for 16 years, I'm sure he would have, tried to grab his way, tried to move something in there. And if you have someone like that for 16 years staying true to herself, that's pretty remarkable. And I don't think anyone in her party can get into those big footsteps.
I was looking at some surveys of the international press, and they all mentioned her modesty and incorruptibility as one of the key traits that made her so popular abroad. Valerie, the young people in our report that we just saw clearly think that Germany's political landscape will be less stable and predictable in future than it has been in the past. What would you say? Are they right? And is that a good thing or a bad one?
Well, they framed it to be a bad thing, but I don't think it has to be a bad thing. I think it can be interesting if the political system, that's why I said in the beginning that it was so important that these elections were won in the middle, because they were won in the middle, so democracy is not at stake here. It's not like a situation we had in the U.S. in 2016 or something like that. There's no, it's not going to be a radical change like that. So I think having a little less stability is actually good for democracy, good for the discussions, good for the debate, especially also in Parliament. Maybe we'll see the debates in Parliament actually taking more center stage, which I think would be great. So I don't see it. I'm very optimistic about the future at this point. So
a lot of people in the CDU at this moment are less optimistic because they had their historic worst result. And you could say that this election appears to mark not just the end of the Merkel era, but also the end of the big tent parties. The SPD has been seeing its share of the vote shrink for more than a decade, and now the CDU appears to be in the same vote, undoubtedly because, as we heard, Merkel took her party toward the center and blurred the boundaries between left and right. How do you see the implications of that, both for the political landscape in general, but also particularly for young voters?
Well, I think for young voters, I'm not sure that it will impact them so much, because I think that the parties that are stepping in are the FDP and the Green Party, which were both very popular among young voters. They were the strongest. So I think they actually shaped this political landscape as well. And I think that's one of the reasons why I think that there might be more debates, more discussions going on in Parliament that are actually going to benefit German democracy and lawmaking. So I think, young people had such a say in this vote. It's actually, I think it's quite a good thing. But obviously the CDU will have to, it'll be interesting to see what will happen to the CDU, because it was such a shaping staple of German democracy, and of course it's very important.
And very much in disarray at the moment. In fact, breaking down the party's support by age yields fascinating results. While older voters far and away preferred the mainstream Social Democrats and Merkel's CDU-CSU, young ones show a strong preference, as we've heard, for the smaller parties, the market-friendly Free Democrats and the climate-focused Greens.
23% of young voters up to the age of 24 voted for the Greens, closely followed by the FDP with a 21% share of the vote in this age group. They are followed by the Social Democrats with 15%, Union parties at 10%, and at the bottom of the list are the Left Party and the AfD. The Greens have made significant gains among young voters compared to the 2017 federal election. Among voters aged 18 to 24, they had an increase of 10% in the vote and an 11% increase among voters up to 34 years of age. For the FDP, the picture is similar, but not quite as strong. Their votes increased by 9% among voters aged 24 years and under, and for voters up to 34 years of age, their share increased by 4%.
So, Regina, the attraction of the Greens for young voters seems pretty self-explanatory. One only needs to think of the Fridays for Future movement. And in fact, we had young climate activists doing a hunger strike right before this election, trying to make that point. But there's been more speculation about why young people would be attracted to a free market party like the FDP. What's your take on that?
Well, part of it, I think, is that worry that we were talking about of the stability that might be gone with Angela Merkel. And also part of it that there are some conservative young people. I mean, not all young people are, left-wing and they care about the environment. There are some people who are conservative, who worry about their pensions, who worry about their salaries, about taxes and all this. And they did not want to vote for CDU under Armin Laschet because he wasn't trustworthy for them. He wasn't, someone who connected with them on so many levels. Take an example that was striking for me during the election campaign, that when he was asked, for example, to name 3 things on the agenda that he wants to do when he gets into to the office, he could only name 2 things. And then when the reporter said, well, what's the third? Well, he said, what else can we do? So for a lot of people, I think that was a striking moment that the CDU actually have run out of ideas. So if I am a conservative and I want to vote for, a centre-right party, I wouldn't vote for the CDU. I'd go vote for the Liberals. I think a lot of them thought that way.
Benjamin, a couple of other explanations I've heard in the last few days, and I haven't seen exact exit polls on this, but certainly there's a lot of discussion about it. I've heard explanations for the youth vote for the FDP, ranging from startup culture to young people tired of lockdowns, wanting their freedom back and thinking that the Free Democrats' emphasis on freedom might guarantee that. What do you think?
I think there's several reasons for that. On one side is how they communicate, where you see how they are active on social media, how they use Instagram, how they use TikTok, how they approach young people. And of course, freedom is very important for the Free Business FDP party. They called for lifting restrictions and to see how proportionate these corona measures are, especially for school kids and students who were like the last ones who really got the freedoms back. And that's the only party who asked for lifting the restriction without siding with the Querdenker movement, because the AfD, the far right, did the same. They said we need our freedoms back, but also siding with anti-vaxxers and people spreading conspiracy theories. So I think that's where the FDP really, well, a lot of young people knew and got to know this party, and that's why they also had a very good result with young voters.
I just want to say, like, the AfD is also just, has such racist standpoints and politicians that I think that is hopefully for a lot of young people a reason not to vote for them, even if they may agree with like some of their points regarding COVID measures.
Nonetheless, in the East, many young people did vote for the AfD. So let's take a brief diversion, because I very much want to get back to the FDP and the Greens. But talk to us a little bit about the result in the East, also as it pertains to younger voters, please, Valerie, because what we've seen is a real split in this election result, with the AfD in the single digits in the West and in double digits, up to 25% of the vote in some of the eastern states actually taking first place. Where is this going, and what does it mean for young people?
Well, I think that's really interesting, because if you look at the youth vote, and I just looked this up before the show, 6% of young voters in the West voted for the AfD and 18% in the East. And this is just very interesting, because we thought that the country was growing together kind of after the fall of the wall and everything. It's been 30 years. So we kind of thought that the country was growing together, but it seems that there's still just such a divide within, and I think we really have to explore that. I mean, I'm not completely sure why this is still why in the East there seems to be such frustration also among young people with the Federal Republic, essentially. And I think we really have to look at that. But it's not a new phenomenon. The AfD was strong with young voters in the East since its founding in 2013.
There seem also to be some interesting disparities in terms of education and AfD votes, but I suggest we leave it there because our time is very, very limited, and I do want to ask all of you to talk a little bit about where things go from here. So when you talk about disparities, by the way, there are some very significant disparities between the Greens and the FDP. Some of them, in fact, reflected in our first report where we heard the slight tensions between concern about stability as opposed to the need for dramatic transformation in connection with climate. So let's talk a little bit about that and these pre-exploratory talks that the Greens and the FDP are currently conducting with each other. In Germany, exploratory talks are normally the preliminary to proper coalition negotiations, but it's quite unique that the two smaller parties have decided to get started on this amongst each other, the two of them together. So what do you think, all of you, starting with Regida, are there real areas of commonality here? Will they find them? And do you think that their key goals will wind up being very watered down in the process?
Well, of course, there will be some commonalities, or they wouldn't sit with each other from the beginning. And I think that picture that they published yesterday of the four leaders when they were sitting together.
A selfie, a very funny selfie, yeah.
I think that says a lot. I mean, they didn't say what happened in those talks, if they agreed on anything, but I think that picture in itself says a lot, that they are willing to come, over those obstacles and reach some kind of an agreement. And they know, I think, also that there is a lot of responsibility on them too, as the small two parties, because if they can't agree, then there is no government, or there's a minority government, or like there isn't really many options, or the SPD and the Union have to get back together, and no one really wants that.
How do you see it, Benjamin? They say they're going in there not with a lot of red lines, but to try to identify common projects of joint interest. Do you think they can be successful at that?
I think so, and they know what their task is, and having these two kingmakers, so the FDP and the Greens, working, and when you see what's going on in the Union, Armin Laschet is still kind of trying to stick to the chancellery, and the SPD, of course, also waiting. I think they know what the two parties have in common is that they want to change the status quo, especially in a country that has like a love affair with the status quo, with this conservatives' ideas. When you see Scholz, as you mentioned, presenting himself in a really Merkel-esque way. And then you have these two parties having new ideas and trying to bring them into the government and getting used to the idea that the conservatives who've been in the chancellery for the past 16 years could go into a position. I think it's really, really interesting.
Let me ask you this, Valerie. Exit polls on topics that voters viewed as decisive for how they cast their vote actually put social welfare issues first, before climate, interestingly enough. Now, is that also true for younger voters, would you say? And could concern about jobs and earnings wind up dampening the urge for more stringent climate policy?
I think that's always a possibility, but if the Green Party makes good on their promise to only have a lot of social programs that are supposed to sort of cushion the blow, maybe, of the climate policies that have to be put in place, I think there's a good chance or there is a chance. I mean, this transformation is going to be so devastating for so many regions, and it's going to be very, very hard. And I think politicians have to say that, and they haven't been saying it enough during this election campaign, in my opinion. So I think that is a great concern, and I do think that one of the benefits of Ampel coalition,
traffic light coalition,
right?
SPD being red, the Free Democrats yellow, and the Greens green, of course.
Exactly, is that I think people trust the Social Democrats a bit more than they trust the Green Party to actually implement social programs for people who are going to suffer under the transformation that has to happen, and under, for example, a higher price for CO2 and stuff like that. So I do think that that there is, and young people are impacted by this just as much as older voters, I'd say. Course.
Let me ask, because we're just about out of time, but let me come back to our title, how much change does Germany need? How much change do youth voters truly want? And ask both of you whether you think a traffic light coalition of the type we're talking about can really deliver what this country needs. Ragita?
No, not really, because everybody will have to make compromises and we will end up with something in the middle.
Certainly, Benjamin, if you think about it, we've got an older white man leading this new traffic light coalition. Yes, it may include some smaller parties that haven't been governing before, but do you think it can deliver more change than the stasis we saw over the last 4 years?
I think it can and it should. Change is always important.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you for being with us, and thanks to all of you for joining in. See you soon.